Good afternoon and welcome to the Healthy Indoors Live Show. I'm your host, Bob Krell, founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors Magazine. And thanks again for joining us this fine Thursday. I think I said that exact same intro last week. That's what happens when you go extemporaneous. Anyway, great to have you here. Today's topic, for those of you who have actually taken a look at the title, is a continuation of a discussion we started back, I believe, on June 17th. We had the subjective science of mold sampling. And that was one where we actually let the entire studio audience in and we just kind of had a roundtable discussion, which was fantastic. One of the most engaged shows we've had in a while. So we're going to continue that part two, because unfortunately 60 minutes came up on us way too freaking quick. So with that, we're going to talk about the same topic, but some other parts in that topic. So with us today, our guest, we actually brought a guest on this time, so it's not just me babbling on the front end. We brought Scott Armour, who is a environmental health science consultant. I got it straight. Environmental health science consultant from Armour Applied Sciences in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hi, Scott.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you guys.
I'm doing okay. It's it's Thursday. Nothing wrong with that. So hey, so welcome. You were part of that discussion when we had the group discussion a few weeks back, and we continued the discussion offline after the fact, of course, because it was pretty interesting stuff. I mean, I think we come from a similar place on the fact that there's some maybe questionable, or at least things that could be done better as far as the sampling methodologies and what we do, just how people utilize sampling in this industry, right?
I think that's a great summary. How to the point, right? And all of the different groups and committees over many, you and I now are counting decades, right? We go like, oh, it's not just 8 years or 9 years ago. We get to say decade or two.
It's millennia.
Yeah, well, it does, right? And I think I even mentioned it last time. We go back to what's the history of indoor air quality and how do we measure? I don't care what setting. We mentioned before the industrial hygiene term. Does that confuse people because it says industrial, right? But industrial hygienists, they measure the indoor environment and continue to measure the indoor environment, and we learned some very basic things from them. But basic, but important and scientific and technical. And they really haven't changed. The sampling is still done the same way, the intent, and we still see the same advice from the texts from the 1980s when we had texts and the first monographs and the first information that was coming out there from really experienced people. And it hasn't changed that much for us. For the industry, for the mold tester, for the regular guy out there who's making a living, there's a huge disconnect. We have two different things. We talked earlier, and I think it was funny. We shared war stories last time when we were on. We do come from a similar place because we've seen a lot of egregious things happen to this notion of indoor air sampling, and obviously many of us focus on mold. And we see an expansion and a diversion from mold right now over the last 3, 4, 5 years with regard to health. And that's why I said, hey, choose environmental health science as my label today. This is my career, environmental health science, because health is what's driving it, right? It drove the mold, it drove sick building syndrome, and it's driving mold. And now it's driving this next thing called environmental acquired illness. And I'm involved, as I mentioned, on several committees right now from several organizations that are all trying to wrap their head around when do you instruct and how do you instruct a professional to take a sample, and that goes against what the vast majority are doing, right? What those who follow the texts are saying one thing, those who are out there doing it for a typical living, so to speak, are doing something different.
Okay, that was pretty diplomatically placed too. So yeah, I mean, And I know we got into, the discussion last time around. We got into, talking about how, there's a certain faction of the industry that's, kind of like sample pump jockeys. And I know that's derogatory and everything, but I mean, there's some truth to it, right? There's people that just their whole consulting on the mold side is take some air samples, and then that's our consulting. And what are the results? And they glean some conclusion from 3 or 4 spore traps, and and that's their report. And that's scary. That does that scares the heck out of me. That here we are in 2021 and we're still having this conversation.
I think that's the hardest part for me and for you and some of our colleagues, is that we're still having this conversation, that every time we teach one group of 100 people, 200 show up that are taught something completely different. And a part of that is the lack of control, the lack of regulation, or some sort of limits on who can do what and what they can call themselves.
Well, lack of agreed upon anything. I mean, there's really not a lot of consensus here, and how you use sampling, when you use sampling, and how you even sample, right?
Well,
I mean, there is, but is there?
Okay, you have to divide it into groups, right? You take people who are very educated about methodology, and I don't want to place emphasis on, oh, you're smarter or you're more educated, but there is a training and education and schooling that takes place in science. When you study science, and I don't care what field it is, sociology, environmental health, chemistry, biology, but when you're doing research and data collection, you're taught a very strict set of rules and guidelines, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. This is the method to achieve good data, to achieve good results. And if you don't get through that part in your schooling, in your education, it doesn't matter what you do, because you're going to have things that are just conclusions that are not valid. And I ask people all the time, and I've done this for a long time. You've seen me do it many times over many decades. If you want to challenge somebody about what they're doing in sampling, just start to open up the conversation with the words reliable and valid. And you will find immediately what they're doing, because if they can't explain how their method was reliable, and they can't explain how the method and the results were valid to answer the question, right? Then you'll find out where they stand. We spoke briefly about the organizations that exist, and we've had over the years, MOUs, memorandums of understandings, and we've had transfer of individuals from one committee to another committee, one organization to another committee. So there is a history, kind of like a pedigree of those who participate in these standards and guidelines and recommendations.
Well, pedigree, or some form of de facto inbreeding, but okay, I'll give you that.
Yeah, it's inbreeding is such an ugly word.
Yeah, kind of, but nonetheless, maybe somewhat appropriate.
Well, okay, so look at AIHA and ACGIH and perhaps and ASTM, right? There's a lot of crossover. We sooner or later, it's not, what is it, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, it's 2 degrees of Bob Krell, right? If you think about it, if you don't know them, I do. If I don't know them, Patrick does, or Susan does, right? All of a sudden, it's 2-3 degrees. We all sort of are aware of each other.
Yeah, I'll acknowledge that there's not a lot of people really at the forefront of this industry, right? I mean, it's not like there's 3 or 4, but I mean, I think it's hundreds, not thousands. That's for sure. So it's a fairly small group.
It's always been that way, right? I remember the first time I went to an industrial hygiene conference and watched Phil Morey give a presentation on mold. And I met members of the ACGIH Bioaerosols Committee, right? That was my entree into the industry. And I said, wow, these people have their act together. They're really, learned and educated and knowledgeable. I want to be like them, right? They were my mentors. I got to know them. I could pick up the phone, talk to them, just like you did with your mentors. And that group stayed small, right? And back then I would say, there was like 1,000 people in the country who were doing indoor air with regard to mold and health. And 100 of them, 50 of them were at the top. And I said, I want to be one of those 100. I want to be that good at my job. And I think now we have tens of thousands of people in the industry but we still have 50 or 100 at the top. And we don't have 10,000 people listening to them because there's another 100 who are teaching something completely different, passing on something different.
That's an interesting point. You're right. And it's funny that you bring up Phil Morey, because it's reminiscent. In 2004, I was actually invited to present at their mold thing they had in Orlando. It was the last time ACJH ever invited me to present on their stage, because the whole diocese, or however you pronounce that, of the committee was sitting there, and I turned around in front of 1,000 people in the room and actually said, you guys are all just kind of like an inbred family. That you keep cross-citing each other on all your papers for the last 30 years. I go, somebody's got to come up with a new idea, and I will say this is one of my I've had a lot of experience. A lot of times I spent time with Phil Morey, but I love that guy. And he belly laughed in his deep voice there. The rest of them were mortified that I said it. And he just like let out, and he just shook his head like, yeah, you did that, didn't you?
And I wish I would have seen that, because I could completely picture Phil, his attitude when he laughed like that.
Nobody else laughed. I want to add that everybody else in the committee didn't laugh. It was only Phil.
Right. And
great guy.
I knew him only a little, but I knew him well enough that I could say, yeah, that would be him, because he understood what was going on, right? He was, so technical and so scientific and so experienced, but he also got it. He
was a realist, though. He was real world.
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. Yes.
Yeah. And that, I think that was like really super unique. Obviously he was one of the pioneers of, one of the people that we're still reading documents that he co-authored, and
right.
And his guidance in the industry. But he was a PhD, but he was a PhD that also understood field work, and he got out on the field. I spent a time crawling under a building with him, in the early 2000s, him in a Tyvek suit and a PAPR crawling alongside of me in a crawl space in a commercial building. And it's like, you don't get that from most people at that caliber.
And you're right. That's a good example. And when I sat on a committee, we were a small select committee up in Montreal, and we were asked to, we were labeled as world experts or something. And I was very honored to be put on that very small committee. And Harriet Amann was there, and Dr. Johanning, and Dr. Johanning was there, and Phil and myself, and 2 or 3 others, and I forget off the top of my head, back in 2014. And we published a document in 2015 from that meeting. It was actually, what they called an audit, and there was an audience of 250 people there from public health and public schools for 2 days. And we reviewed a lot of their documents and talked about them and critiqued their method. And I kicked my thing and it shook.
You didn't shake my camera though. That was at my end. That was a funny reaction, by the way, because I was adjusting a camera here in this studio.
And I kicked my table.
You kicked it all the way here to Syracuse.
And he taught, I will never forget the line he used, because here we are talking, about schools and health and teachers' complaints and kids getting sick and whether mold can go through concrete and all these like kind of technical things. And he goes, buildings have a memory. And so no matter how good you do your mold remediation, there's a great chance that your sampling, especially he was referring to air sampling, but any sampling is going to capture what was once there, because this building is going to hold on to it. And the whole point of that audit, the main context from the members, and we were think about this, you had Phil Morey, Johanning, Amann, myself, a couple others, we ended up being in unanimous agreement that sampling is not how you enter an assessment for health of a building, for the health of the occupants in a building. It was an adjunct. It was much later in the process. And we were unanimous about this. And that's where he brought that up. He goes, you're going to find these false positives because of the memory of the building, right? Because it's going to hold on to a few aspergillus spores off in a corner, and you're just going to happen to walk in that corner and sample them. It has nothing to do with health. It has nothing to do with the condition of the building. And I love that he used that phrase, memory. And I always pictured Phil kind of like what you just said, like in a hallway somewhere of a 12-story building that was being demolished for mold, and him walking up this flight of stairs, taking samples and recording the memory of the building.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I remember him crawling down into this crawl space with me. It was this big assisted living new structure, so it was like couple 100,000 square foot wood frame construction that had a significant water problem in the crawl space, and it was moldy. All the superstructure of the building was moldy. It was just awful. They hadn't even opened it yet. And I was like, I'll go down there, you know. It's like, you don't need to go. No, I'll come down with you. And I'm like, he's suiting up, and I'm thinking, oh, good God. It's like he's going to crawl down this ladder into this muddy crawl space. It was like a World War I trench down there. There was just water and mud, and we're crawling on our bellies. It was awful, just awful.
And that's what people do. And, one of the things I think we need to head for, I'm going to throw this out there in the beginning. We can talk about it later or set up a different show. And I mentioned it earlier, was that, we need some sort of a new consensus in the industry. We need a new organization to represent all the organizations. Whether it's ad hoc or semi-formal, I'm not sure. Whether we all need to join together and create a consensus white paper. But, we have committee right now. I mean, think about it. I'm sitting on committees from 3 different organizations, and the debate is nearly similar in all of them, right? Whether it's post-remediation verification, assessment, writing protocols, creating some sort of remediation, assessing health. And there's disconnect, right? If I have one concept that I'm a specialist at, and we'll talk about this in a minute, for example, the S520 condition 2. If I need to get that concept across to all 3 or 4 committees at different times, think of the amount of time I'm spending trying to educate people who come to those committees with no real concept of what that condition 2 is and when someone needs to know about it. That's a lot of repeated education. Mm-hmm. And we need to somehow get together so that we exchange information rapidly, almost in real time, so that, for example, the schools committee talks to the S520 remediation committee, talks to the S530 assessment, talks to the ASTM verification, right? That information should exchange hands almost in real time. Because we don't want to keep contradicting or either reinventing the wheel or contradicting each other because some of us don't understand what the other concepts are.
If only there was a space where people could all cross communicate. I had to do it. I just, I can't stop myself sometimes. I'm not very well filtered either, as we mentioned in brief.
What do you think we could call that?
Yeah, it's some kind of a community, a gathering. Anyway, I want to invite all of our studio audience. You can turn your cams on if you'd like on the virtual studio audience, because we will start briefly. We'll be getting into kind of a round robin discussion here. Not to cut you off, Scott. I want to continue on the points you're on. I just wanted to let everybody know within a few minutes we'll probably shift and start entertaining some comments.
That was my industry soapbox for a moment. I don't have an answer to that. I just know in my gut, we need to do that. We need to figure out how to get that going.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily like there needs to be another organization. I saw in the chat Susan chimed in there. And by the way, Susan Valenti, our editor from Healthy Indoors, is in the chat for those of you in the virtual audience. We also have chat on the community. If you're watching us over on the community side, you can chat over there, and we can see that up on our studio monitors as well. But I'm not sure we need another organization, but we do need to have these different organizations not be operating completely in silos, right?
Let's call it a collaboration. Right?
Yeah, cross-pollination or whatever. Yeah, something like that. I mean, honestly, if you've got 3 organizations all doing, working on standards for something or standards or whatever, position papers, and they're all in similar topics and they're all working independently of each other, that doesn't seem really an efficient way to do things.
Well, especially if in the end, for example, say you have 3 standards being worked on, and which so happens we do, and one of them finishes first, and they're ready to go, and right, because they started earlier, and now they're ready to go to public review. They're not published yet, but they're ready to go to public review.
It sounds like the vaccines for SARS-CoV.
Yeah, and then we have a second committee and a third committee, and they're all 2 or 3 steps behind each other, but the second and third committee are going to discuss, debate, and try to figure out the same thing the first committee just solved, right? They spent 2 years at schools, well, more than that, but say the schools committee spent 2 years resolving an issue that maybe these other 2 committees will adopt immediately if we just knew about it. Instead, I'm on an S530 committee at ICRC. I am fearful we're going to re-debate and the same thing that's been debated and concluded by another group. And we ought not to be wasting our time on that. and neither should they, right? Vice versa. It's a two-way, three-way street.
Mhm.
There.
Yeah,
And
no,
that's
I
where
mean,
my concept comes from.
yeah, and I think it makes total sense. I think the practicality of it's difficult. I mean, at least for my 35 years in this industry, I've never seen everybody play well together in the sandbox for a prolonged period. That's just, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. It's just, you know, there are a lot of factors that involve, you know, who's going to take the lead on things, right?
Yeah,
Well,
unfortunately.
you know,
You know, it's we wanted to talk about Samley, and that's kind of political, and that's kind of
yeah, let's get out of that.
right.
Let,
So
let, let,
what's
let's
the
get
deal
to the
with
let's
Samley?
get to the topic at hand. But that was a good side discussion that was important, I think.
What did I say? What were the other thing? Oh, condition 2.
Condition 2, yeah.
Yeah. Condition 2. It's my new thing, right? It's not a new, but my use of it as an example. Look at Pat grinning. He knows.
Well, first of all, define condition 2 for people that don't know what condition 2 is, because there might be some viewers here that are going, "What's condition 1?"
Yeah,
if I hadn't read S520, I wouldn't know.
Well, let's put it this way. I just reviewed a project where there was a horrific, egregious recommendation to fog a house to get rid of all the mold. And the person was certified by a very recognizable organization or firm or company. I don't know what you would call it. And they go around training and certifying people for a very long time, perhaps more than 15 or 20 years. And most of us would
We're getting very specific now. So let's move on, keep speaking, but you don't have to totally paint that picture.
He clearly did not know what condition was. So condition, it comes from the ICRC, from the 520 professional remediation standard. So what happened in the original document, they created this thing called condition 1, 2, and 3. And condition 3 is the state of mold growth. Condition 3 is that the stuff you can see, the visible, obvious mold growth on a surface. Had nothing to do with being concealed or not. It's just, if you find a component, what is on it? It's mold growth. That's condition 3. Condition 1 is what they labeled, and still remains labeled, normal fungal ecology. In other words, what's typical in a healthy, safe, non-damaged building. You might find
non-complaint building. Not even, don't use the term healthy, right? Because you don't know, but I mean, a typical building, a non-complaint, what you wouldn't classify as a moldy building.
It's not a moldy building. It doesn't suffer from some sort of, chronic or repeated or severe water damage where there's likely to be growth. So that building that everyone's confident is in decent shape, right? You might find a little mold growing on some grout in a shower that somebody missed with the Comet cleanser and the brush, right? But it's expected to be normal. And then condition 2, which is in the middle, is a contaminated state. But it is contaminated with the debris of the mold, the spores and the fragments and other debris from the mold growth. It is what I now call the invisible condition. And the reason I focus on that word is because we so often say you can assess by and verify or do clearance by the visible dirt, dust, debris, and growth. Right? So we walk into a building to do clearance and we look around and say, hey, I can't see any growth on these components. I can't see any dirt, dust, and debris on the ground. So that's the visible condition. Condition 2, because it's spores and fragments of the filaments.
Right. It's microscopic debris, potentially.
It's really small stuff, right? It turns out this stuff is invisible. You need a microscope to see it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is separate from the growth. It is what's next to the growth, down the hall from, on the other floor from. Nobody has a good definition for what is acceptable. In other words, and no one has a good definition or method to determine, did that stuff come from the growth on the wall? And by definition from the S520, condition 2 is from the condition 3 that is being remediated. So if I have, mold.
Is it though?
Yes.
Could have been pre-existing.
No, condition is from the mold growth in the building that is identified for the remediation.
How do you prove that?
That's a tough one.
You may identify it in the future for remediation, right? You may go, why do I have so many spores on this table? And then you look to the left because you've been working over on the east wing. You look to the west wing, and you go, oh, darn, we missed some mold growth there. But the point is, it's connected to the mold growth in that building. It's not what blew in from the mulch outdoors.
So it's a
How
presumption.
do you know that? Well, I mean, based on what the flora, or I mean, what it is, but okay, all right, keep going.
Right, but that's the
All right,
purpose.
you know,
What
I'll
would be
entertain
the
that.
purpose? Right. Think about the logic. What would be the purpose of taking occupant protections and workplace controls to prevent cross contamination? I'm not preventing cross contamination from mulch outdoors. I'm preventing cross contamination from the mold on the ceiling in the hallway that I'm remediating. And then if I'm remediating that, where does my cross contamination begin or end? Right? It's because we don't know, is it 100 spores, 1,000 spores, or bazillion spores per cubic inch? That is a hazard. We don't know. So
and also what organism, you know, I mean, if that matters, you know, I mean, I don't know if we know if that matters necessarily.
Right. But so now you're looking for something invisible, and people want to say, oh, well, it's whatever debris, whatever condition 2 is the contamination adjacent to the remediated space. Well, how far is adjacent? 1 foot? Is it a hallway? Is it a hospital room? Or is it all the way down to the end by the elevator, 10 hospital rooms away, or 10 offices away, or 3 bedrooms away, right? We don't know where to draw that line.
I got to let Pat chime in because Pat's chomping. I mean, he's got the Aurora Borealis behind him, you know, not coincidentally because he's from Alaska, but go for it.
You don't. So what, Scott, I guess what you're saying is, if you're going to use the term condition 2, you have to have a condition 3 first. You can't have condition 2 without condition 3.
In the building.
In the building. So you're presuming that the condition 2 is from the condition 3. So therefore you're going to clean it all up. You're going to remove the condition 3. You're going to clean up the condition 2.
If it meets the qualifications of what a condition 2 is. A condition 2 has to affect something in the building, right? So if it's contamination, because by definition, contamination affects aesthetics, utility, or health. So now, how many spores does it affect? How many spores does it take to jam up the gears of a machine? How many spores does it take to jam up the electronics of a computer, right? How many spores does it take to affect the appearance of the carpet? How many spores does it take to impact the health of the occupants? Otherwise, it's not contamination. Contamination is something unwanted that's causing a negative effect. It just doesn't happen to be spores.
How many?
I don't know. That's not for me to determine.
No. Okay. All right.
I am just defining it because now I'm going to ask you, Mr. Remediator, Mr. Assessor, Mr. Recommender.
Mr. Recommender?
The decider in chief. How many spores? Right? You're going to go out there. You're going to find condition 2. You're going to redline it, so to speak. It starts here. It ends here. And you're going to tell somebody to clean it up, and you're going to tell them how good to clean it up. All I'm doing is defining it to make sure you justify what you're recommending. So if you justify 100 spores per square inch, go right ahead. But I'm going to tell, if I'm representing the building, I'm going to say, well, you better justify 100 spores. Why do I have to spend that much money to clean to 100 if 1,000,000 is okay, or 1,000, or whatever number? Okay. I don't care what number it is, justify it. But justified based on the definition.
So if you don't have any visible mold in a building, but you have occupant complaints and you have a visibly dirty environment, dusty, dirty environment, is that a condition 2?
No, because that's an agglomeration of many types of dirt, right? I don't know what's in that dirt. I'm going to bet you, though, by mass fraction, mold is going to be one of the smallest fractions within that dirt.
Which you would presume that would be normal. What if you sampled that dirt and it was mostly mold? Then do you have condition?
Or a high, or let's say high, not even mostly, Pat, but just say higher than a fragment concentration, pretty good percentage.
Things that likely shouldn't be there.
It's what's the effect on the building of that, right? If you give me a gram of that dust,
human complaint,
it's a little cute, right? The size of a dice.
Mm-hmm.
If I start to break that up, the vast visual of that, I'm still going to have invisible mold. No matter what, I'm never going to have enough mold fragments and spores to become visible. So that mold is still not impacting the aesthetics. I'm never going to have enough spores and fragments in there to affect the function or utility of any mechanical or electronic devices in that building. You know, so now we're down to, is it just a fraction? I don't mean a fraction like 1/100th. I mean, a piece of the puzzle could be 1/3, right? Any fraction. What fraction of the dust is it, and how do you know it's affecting the health?
Yeah,
well, but that's tough, because we're talking environmental sampling, and then in the same sentence you talk about affecting the health, but we don't have that correlation, the dose effect. We don't have that for any of it.
Then why
anywhere in this freaking industry? How many spores per cubic meter make you sick? I don't know. Because
then why are you cleaning it? Then how can you justify
because
cleaning 100 or 1,000 or a million?
There's a leap of faith. There's a lot of circumstantial stuff around this, that, to say what the number should be. There's no agreed upon number that's pass or fail for mold deposition in a space.
Right. So why not just make it visible? Why not just make it like a normal housekeeping and say, just make it visibly free of dirt, dust, and debris? Pat's example is great. This dirty place, you in a building, the offices, the hallways have this layer of dirt and dust because they've been shut down for COVID for 15 months. Make it visibly. Don't worry about counting the mold. Don't sample the mold. Just make it free of visible dirt, dust, and debris. And that fraction of mold will go along with that dirt. It'll disappear when you vacuum and you wipe and you Swiffer and you wash and you mop. All right, whatever your housekeeping is.
And the mold in that condition too would be defined as mold that were to, let's say, to take a tape lift, you wouldn't see evidence of actual active growth on that, right? It would just be settled, random stuff all mixed up, as opposed to you got a whole mycelia pattern where you can see that something's actually growing on that surface microscopically.
Right. Or
that would still, even if it was microscopic and you couldn't see, it would still be a condition 3.
Right. And that's, how many of us have actually gone out of our way to try to see if 2 inches from the visible growth actually had any microscopic growth on it, right? That's
done that many times, and it usually does. The part that you clear with your flashlight is usually not clear.
So if you go into a building that has history of microbial growth, visible microbial growth that might have been removed in a manner that it's not a recognized practice or something like that, but you can't see it anymore, that's still a condition 2 if you have that dust, debris, or whatever present, because there's a history. But how would you ever know that came from that mold? You don't. You just have to. It's a whole bunch of assuming, because it's all we got.
So if you have, I like the example. Pat and I have discussed this for several years now, back and forth intermittently, right? We come up with little ideas and we throw them at each other and see what sticks. So the concept then is, hey, we had a remediation in this office or this school or library or police station or something, and a month goes by or 3 months goes by, and Pat gets a phone call to investigate because somebody's got the same symptom as they had before when there was water damage and mold growth, and he shows up. And he goes into the area that was told to him was remediated, and he sees something. Well, that's visible dirt, dust, and debris. Someone didn't do their job right. Versus, is it invisible, right? And I think that's where the jam is right there. With regard to sampling, there's no, and you said it, you both used the word assume, right? So who's assuming that this stuff or this area, this 1 foot, 3 foot, or 30 feet away from the mold growth is condition 2? So you really only have 2 ways to do it. You assume it, and you just say, well, I'm going to clean 5 feet out from the mold because I think that's where most of it falls. Or I'm going to clean 5 offices down the hallway because I assume. Or like some people say, the lungs of the building were turned on, the HVAC was blown, and the whole darn high rise needs to be cleaned because there's mold spores from the basement mold throughout the whole office. I don't know, but you're making the assumption. All I ask is you better justify that assumption. You better come up with something that justifies you recommending to the owner that they spend that much time, effort, and money and resources cleaning that far of a condition 2. So it's, you assume it, or you call an assessor, an IEP, and hygienist, industrial hygienist, you tell them, hey, go figure out where condition 2 is. And now, like you said, what are my references? How do I know? And how do I correlate this stuff in the dust on the floor to the stuff on the ceiling tiles in the hallway where the pipes are dripping?
But moreover,
But
moreover, Scott, how do you make the determination, if you're that professional, what potentially could have adverse health outcomes when we don't actually have? There's not a table, that you look at, or a chart or something. It's a judgment call, is it not? Completely.
That's a good question. I don't believe, what I have learned is that almost all studies that indicate health effects from water damage and mold growth, and I use those terms coincidentally, they always appear together, so to speak. One, it might be dry, but it's still water damage. Is that once the visible water damage and visible and associated mold growth and associated visible dirt, dust, and debris is gone, we don't have excess incidence of health effects. So once you remove that condition 3, that is almost always sufficient to not find any more correlation of health effects. So we're almost all of the initial studies look at what's actually there in the health. And yes, if there's water damage and mold growth, you have health effects. No water damage and no mold growth, can't pin the health effects on it. So it becomes, who cares what's conditioned? Who cares what's invisible? Just give me visibly free of dirt, dust, and debris, like your housekeeping. Everything else is thrown up in the air, whether it's, like you said, where's the study that says, is it mycotoxins? Is it glucans, the cell wall components? Is it spores? Is it allergens? What's triggering it?
Or is it all the above? I mean, I think one of the problems that we all have in this industry, from the professional side, is we're still making a lot of leaps of faith, and there's a lot of stuff we're not sure about, right? A lot of it's anecdotal. We do this, and like our experience says that when we do this, most people don't complain. So okay, well, so from an is there science behind that? Well, kind of loose science, right? But I mean, we're basically we're doing, us as professionals, like, we know in our experience we've done these things, and at the end the occupants have not had complaints. So okay, so this is
Right.
I base my opinion on how to handle this based on what's worked, what I believe has worked for us in the past, based on our experience.
Which is, and then we have a group experience, right? Pat's experience, your experience, my experience.
Right. And I can't use my sampling, my methods, my years of doing it the same way and compare it to Scott's sampling, Scott's methods, Scott's ways of doing it for years as a direct comparison.
Oh, you're talking numerically.
Well, yeah, like
because you're using if somebody uses semi-aggressive versus totally quiescent, right? It doesn't disturb anything. The numbers aren't going to match up.
Which is why I think you will never see like a document come out that says that 100 spores of this is good, 100 or 101 spores is bad, because you can't have that because of all of the variables. But like if I put an EPA document there and an AIHA document there and an ACGH document there, if I could overlap those things, the phrases are almost identical through all of them when they talk about like sampling, since this is a sampling conversation. But like Bob and I talked about this earlier, I'm looking at one of them right here right now, and the title of the document ends in a consumer focus. Consumer focus. There are professionals that use these documents as their guides, but the documents are all consumer documents. So I think that in the sampling industry, there's a lot of bad press, if you will, because people use the wrong information, not realizing what that information is focused on. And like we spoke earlier, when they say no sampling, what kind of sampling are they talking about? Are they talking about the little settle plate? Are they talking about the spore trap? Are they talking about, agar plates? I mean, what are they talking about when they talk about sampling? They never tell you in these documents what kind of sampling they're talking about. They just say no sampling, not necessary.
Well, New York State says that. New York State Department of Labor, who administers the New York State mold licensing program, sampling is not necessary. So they just say that carte blanche. That's like.
Are they saying don't go down to the hardware store and buy that kit, or are they saying don't hire an industry professional who has experience in sampling that can develop a plan?
I can't speak for them, but I believe that their intent is don't hire the people that are going to charge you a bunch of money to come in and take some samples that don't mean all that much. Just clean up the problem. I'm just saying that's what I believe the intent is, at least on our state level here.
What if you sample an environment that's going to be remediated? You go in and you do a specific sampling plan, and you do them samples right before the remediation. You let the remediation take place, and then you come in and you do exactly that same thing all over again. And you compare those two directly together. And they're both snapshots in times. Mother Nature's probably changed outside. There's lots of other little things. But let's say the initial sampling looked comparable to what you like to compare it to. Your data review says that this doesn't look all that bad. But the second set of samples are blown to smithereens. You got millions of spores per cubic meter or something like that. Is that not useful to say that the remediation was unsuccessful?
Scott? I'm gonna let you weigh it. Now, see, now you suddenly choose to filter yourself. Look at that. It's like,
now back up a little bit.
It's a rhetorical question. I want Pat to answer for himself because he answered that a while ago, and so did you. You said we have nothing that informs us. We have nothing that informs us that say the sampling that he did. We have nothing that informs us that 1 million spores or 100,000 is bad.
Other than our anecdotal experience, because there is a correlation. We probably all agree that when we go in, let's say for example, I'm going to go with the spore trap, just because we've been talking spore trap, and we get counts, in the tens of thousands or approaching 100,000 counts per cubic meter. People tend to have issues in those spaces. I mean, those are pretty high numbers. You start getting up in those, 6-digit numbers.
Yeah, and like my lab can produce me the averages of 17 years worth of my sampling for any zip code that I've sampled in. And I can look at those averages and say, well, here's what's normal for this area on spore counts outside. I can also look at the inside averages and say, yeah, this might be normal, but that's kind of a skewed data because some of those houses might have really high counts because there's mold everywhere, and other houses might be really, really clean because they have, daily mate service or something like that. You can't really use that inside data. But the outside data is Mother Nature. And that's what we typically start a data review with, is what does inside and outside look like? So unfortunately, and I've had these conversations with both of you, unfortunately, my thing about that is there's too many people, and Bob said pump jockeys, but there's too many people that stop right there. And that's their extent of sampling and data review. Inside to outside, done. Here, customer, here's your results. And
we have an audience question too, but I'll let you finish this thought.
Well, no, I mean, and I think that's one of the bad names on sampling is that's the end of the process, and then there's no conclusion drawn by anybody. It's a set of samples with a comparison inside and out, and everybody's done. But there's so much more to it than that. There's so much more, especially in the data review part. And again, sampling should only be done once all of the investigation is complete, and you can justify the fact that you want to use some sample data to back up your conclusion that you already have. You're using a sample of data to help your conclusion. But you got to have that experience, I guess.
That's my concern, and Scott and I had it in pre-show, and you and I spoke at the community meetup earlier, Pat, is that there's a faction of the industry, people in the industry, and I'm not going to single out one group of people who go out and do sampling in the field, but that live and die by what they get on their report of taking some spore traps. And again, they typically take spore traps. They don't even do surface stuff. They typically do some spore traps, and and what comes back is, pass or fail, and they make their entire hypothesis of what's going on in the space based off of a limited number of air samples. And they don't necessarily dig any deeper. That if that's your first line of thought, to pull the samples and see what that means, you're doing something wrong, in my opinion.
So what is the percentage of mold assessors that are doing that? I think it's the majority.
Yeah,
I know, but it's horrible. If you're not going in and doing a visual, first of all, interview with the occupants. Hello, get the historical data in the space. For God's sakes, try to find the history of building. Was there a fire in the building 7 years ago that had the fire department drop 200,000 gallons of water in it? These are things that are kind of germane to what might be going on in the interstitial spaces that you can't see visually when you first walk in.
Or almost anywhere too, right? I mean, it's a horrible state of affairs, right? That we have these people coming in doing 2-3 samples and making decisions on it. They've never done the interview, right? I do 4 things: the inspection, I do the building history, I do what I call the functional medicine of the building. It's the holistic approach. Is the building working the way it was intended, right? Or did something screw it up? Somebody put in something backwards or upside down or faulty. And then the occupant, what I call the health review, because this is specifically for my clients who are patients, for environmental illness or suspect mold illness. So I go through the occupant interview for symptoms and diagnoses and things. And the 5th thing, is not included. The 5th thing is sampling. I do not price sampling in my assessment. That comes way later. 90% of my health assessments I find, and the people that I've taught find the problems without a single sample. We don't need samples to go find the water damage and the mold, even when it's concealed. The fear of every client is, well, what if it's hidden behind the paneling? Well, if we do our first job right, 90% of the time, I don't need a sample. I'm going to be able to predict with really high confidence, 95, 98% confidence, that there's something concealed behind something somewhere. Or I need to go, get a HVAC contractor to open up to see the coils or something. So we do have that going for us, but the mold industry, the mold testing sampling industry doesn't want to listen to that at all.
And we're on the same page with that. I mean, I've been a consultant for 34 or 5 years now. And same thing with clients. Like I don't quote sampling in our proposal. I quote what we charge per sample in the event when we're there with what we see, what we could do. And I always say, this is something we will discuss with you on site when we get out there and actually physically see what we got there. Does it make sense or not?
So here's what you do, and I'm sure not you, but in general, the industry. Once you decide what samples you want to take, I always tell people that all sampling must increase the power of our decision making. So a lot of people say, oh, you have to form a hypothesis, or you have to follow the scientific method.
Well, you're doing that. You're doing a shortened version of that, right? You're doing hypothesis light.
Yeah, sampling is not at all the scientific method. That scientific method is reserved for discovery and confirmation of theories. To explain the material universe. What we're doing is we're confirming, or we're providing an answer. So say, hey, for Pat, right? His example was, his question really was, when he gave us that great scenario on sampling, did the contractor disturb the mold and leave behind some excess contamination in the air? And he goes in and he says, oh my gosh, there's 100,000 spores in the air. The contractor didn't clean the air back to normal or condition 1 air concentrations for mold spores. That's really the question he's using that sample to answer, right? So if we don't have a good question and a good answer, most of your questions you can answer ahead of time. You can predict, we can predict what the results will be. So why waste it? I just reviewed 2-3 days ago the report. They said, oh, the basement has a lot of mold spores in the air. And then the client, and I had the mold tester's report. It didn't describe anything about the basement. And then the owner tells me, oh yeah, he found all this yellow mold underneath the wooden steps in the basement. And I go, why the hell did he sample? We knew it was going to be elevated. You have active growth in a damp, cavity under the stairs. So it was a waste. That he didn't enhance the power of her decision making at all. Her decision was, do I need to remediate something in my basement or not? The answer was absolutely. You have visible yellow mold on all this wood. So it didn't help anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Was that air?
That's what we don't do, is we don't, and that's where the justification comes in. So Pat's very good at laying out his process, because he uses a lot of things to justify the sampling, but he also uses the sampling the other direction to justify the decision making.
And I'm not approaching it as a health. I don't talk about health to these people. This has nothing to do with health. I'm using sampling to help me give an idea if something worked or made it worse, if you will. I hope that makes sense. But like your scenario with the basement, was there enough, in a professional opinion with a data review, was there enough airborne spores to justify cleaning that whole basement, or should you just contain the closet under the stairs and just remove the mold under the stairs? Would the sample not be helping you in making that decision? Or are you just going to clean the whole place because there's mold?
Well, surface sampling might help. An air sample is not going to help make that call.
Yeah, the air sample doesn't tell me about the rest of that basement or the content.
You're going to surface level now, which makes more sense anyway. Hey, I want to give Terry has a question. He's been waiting patiently to ask it, so I'm going to let Terry ask your question. You have to unmute though. You're still muted. There you go.
Actually, this is such a great and interesting discussion. I don't want to ask my question.
Well, there you go. We made you wait too long. I get it.
No, not at all. Sincerely, great discussion and great issues. But some of what Scott has said has really stimulated dozens of questions in my mind. And I'm certainly going to renew my IICRC subscription so that I can see this draft that's coming out. But some of the things you said about condition 2 and condition 3 just blow my mind, Scott. You all know I don't have industrial hygiene credentials, professional credentials, but I'm well informed on a lot of issues from reading research reports and so forth. And Scott, questions like, if I understood you correctly, you said condition 3 is defined as being able to visibly see mold on surfaces. And if I understood correctly, you said condition 2 derives only from a poor job at remediating condition 3. Okay.
No, the first is correct with the caveat. You have to look into the concealed spaces. So it doesn't, remember the old argument against New York City, right? Was, oh my God, it says visible mold. So you look in the room, nobody ever cut open wall. Well,
Right.
Actually New York City in paragraph section 2B said, you must consider what's concealed, right? It didn't ignore, it said, you still need to do your history and your evaluation to see, is there water damage in a cavity, open it up, and is there visible mold in that cavity? And that was the great lie of the people who didn't want to use New York City, because they never got to section 2 and read the caveat that Chris DeAndrea made sure was in there, right?
They also said spray water though to stop spore distribution.
What?
No, I'll let it go.
Yeah, right.
Keep going.
Exactly. So that was the great lie of New York City, right?
Chris has got a hit on me again for once again, saying something about the New York City guide, but
right now. So when we say visible, I mean, what is on that component, right? There's sufficient evidence to say it's been wet, it's wetted, it is concurrently wet, there is visible growth, something's going on with it. And condition 2 is not from the remediation. Condition 2 is from the condition 3, the visible mold growth, like the stuff that you find in the building cross-contaminated other surfaces, other components. So yes, for example, at the time of sporulation, you might be able to say that the air near the growth that's sporulating has excess spores in it, and that is not normal. That's not condition 1. That's not normal fungal ecology. There's too many spores from that mold on the wall.
Also, though, but right, to clarify, condition 3 does not always have to be totally visible either, does it? It just has to be active growth, correct?
There can condition 1 actually accounts.
Condition 3, I'm talking about now.
Yeah, right. But
I mean, if you take a tape lift, you can see active growth on the surface, but to the naked eye, you don't see it. Isn't that still condition 3?
That's the monkey wrench in all this.
Yeah, I mean,
1, because
or shouldn't it be? I guess is the better question.
Right. Condition 1 allows for kind of, I forget the exact word, the ambient growth. So what just naturally might occur, you might have small microscopic growth in a condition 1 normal condition, right? There is no good line other than visible at beyond, the visible condition 3. How far do you keep sampling? Like you said, you take a lot of samples left and right of that line, and you discover, hey, 3 inches out, there's always invisible growth 3 inches out, and there's never invisible growth, 24 inch, whatever numbers, seem to match. That's gets kind of like a sticky wicket, so to speak.
But it's an issue if you sidestep that and you only go for what's visible, you could be leaving a lot of stuff there that's going to bloom into something more.
So doesn't that then force, I see Perry's, but doesn't that then force the person doing the inspection and preliminary determination under S520, shouldn't they be then calling in the IEP, the hygienist, the specialist to sample and discern the lines for condition 3, the lines for condition 2?
The S520 states 2 feet, correct? 2 feet from the outer perimeter of visual.
No, it uses that as an example. It doesn't say
Okay.
you must. There is no should do something 2 feet.
But it does state that, right? And that's, so I mean, it's not saying that's a must or a requirement, but and you hear that all the time. People always say a 2 foot margin, right? Or 2 foot, that's common.
I'm not allowed to say, but I think
I know
from the revision, because that's a remnant of the reference guide when the reference guide existed and was copied into the standard.
It was reference guide. You're right. It was.
Yeah, it was. It is in the reference.
Yeah,
guide.
so we have to be careful.
That's not the, if we're talking standard, you're right. The reference guide is a separate, and that's not ANSI approved. That's a whole different.
Yeah, it's just the support. It's like a teaching document. The reference
It's like,
is a teaching document.
it's like samples supporting your decision. It's a reference guide supporting the S520. So back to Terry's question though, you in my mind, you can get condition 2 from a botched remediation. That condition 2 may not have existed prior to the remediation. You got the happy mold on the wall that's not doing anything other than growing and sitting there. Well, it's got water, food, and the whole shebang. And then the remediator just comes in, rips, smirch, tears, and puts it everywhere. Now you do have condition 2, and that did come from the remediation.
Right. Yes.
Which is where you get failures after the fact. And another thing about sampling, not that this is right or wrong or a proper way to use it. I would say there are some remediators out there that I know of that if they know there's no sampling, no IEP, IH, whatever involved in their job, they're done in and out 3 days. If they know an IEP, IH, or whatever is involved on their job, 5, 6, 7 days before they're off that site, because they know somebody's going to come back and hold them to what they did. So sampling is something, if you mention that word to a remediator, it seems to push them into, sometimes, not all remediators are like this, but it seems to push them into a more thorough job, I would have to say, which is not right. It's not right. It shouldn't be like that. Every job should be exactly the same, no matter who's overseeing it or whether there's third-party confirmation or any of that kind of a thing. But
you can make the argument that every surgery should be the same and every auto mechanic should do a great job too. I mean, and I'm not saying it's to diss you here. It's the problem is in this industry, it seems to be even a little bit more flagrant.
I'm going to quote, earlier I quoted Phil Morey, and I'm going to quote somebody else. So I was in a 520 committee and I went up to the chair, and the chair at the time was Bob Baker. And I mentioned to him what I had experienced. And I said, 100% of all mold remediations that I have ever walked on to do clearance, and I may have been involved from the very beginning, from the middle, or I never even knew what was going on. I just walked in. 100% of them I failed without a single sample. 100% failed the visual clearance. 100%. So what Pat is saying is somewhat correct, but why do we bother taking samples? Why don't you just tell them you're going to do a visual clearance? Now, Bob's response to me, Mr. Baker responded, so Scott, so we shouldn't be writing a standard on how to do mold remediation. We should be writing a quality control standard. And one of our fellow members, Pat, Tom Flood, he agrees. We should be writing quality control. What is a good remediation? Sampling should not be the primary way of determining if you did a good job. Just go out and see if they got the visual done, right? Do a white glove, white cloth, do a black glove.
But that is first level. I mean, any person that knows what they're doing as a consultant industry, I mean, the first tier, I mean, if they're just going in and just pulling some spore traps or, some form of air sample, and that's how they clear a job and they don't even look around, that's insanity.
It is insanity, but there's a.
It's got to be aesthetically clean. I mean, way before S520 existed, we were doing that 30 years ago. It's like, if it's dirty, you fail.
How did we start this conversation 1 hour ago? We said, oh my God, the stuff we learned in 1984, 1988 is still existing. And it all goes down to, did you do a darn good job? And that's really what Pat's saying too. He's just found a way to use that sampling. I found a way to use visual. I walk in and I find the dirt and debris or growth every time. And realize,
LED flashlight will find a lot of things. You just got nowhere to look. I mean, look on top of doors.
well, the worst.
The top of the door. People don't clean that ever. Like, duh.
Why
Top
is
of the
it
door
that
frame.
40 to 60% of all jobs that I have where someone else has been paid to do the assessment for mold or to do the remediation, and that client has already been told, hey, you're all good. There's no more mold. 40 to 60% that changes with the year, but I can find significant mold growth and water damage in 40% or more of those jobs without a flashlight in a standing position. So I don't even have to look in the crawl space.
Well, because you're looking.
Right, LED.
You're looking. We're at a point where we have to get into the wrap, but yeah, because there's different motivations here, right? I mean, there's motivations to pass and move it forward, and and then there's true people that are actually independently going out and saying whether the job was properly done,
right.
And they're not always both happening.
And then now I'm going to wrap this up. And then now is the people who are going out there and sampling, just egregiously oversampling and convincing people that they know what they're doing when they just sample. And I saw Terry use the word endotoxins, right? And by the way, endotoxins are from bacteria, not from mold. So we want to make sure we don't conflate those unless we're talking
Absolutely.
about.
Yeah, but microbial, I think you do need to conflate a little, because how often is there just mold in a damp indoor environment? You're usually dealing with bacterium as well.
Endotoxins are even worse to sample for. Mycotoxins are worse to sample because we have even less information on what their typical characterization should be. What's their typical concentration, and we even have less information than that for what is their relationship to health, right? So every time we go to one of these kind of what I would call these kind of esoteric constituents that we want to sample for, we have less and less and less information, and we're approaching demanding a clean room status. We're approaching, a lot of these people are demanding zero tolerance, right? Which is absurd, because we don't even know how to approach zero tolerance. We don't even know if it's bad. And so this is the egregious part. These are the people who come in and say, yeah, I'll bring an assessor, and then when they leave, they have $10,000 worth of sampling for this homeowner, right? And the homeowner is pressured like a used car salesman pressures you into buy the undercoating. They feel embarrassed because this guy's been presented to them as the guru of all things, environmental health and mold. And it's a sham when we should be focusing right now what is visible. If we all agreed, make it as clean as you possibly can. Just visibly clean everywhere. Go to white glove, black glove tests, go to cloth testing. Define that area. Forget about the lungs of the house using an HVAC to blow spores of the third floor bedroom upstairs. Come on, that's not conditioned to. There's no one that's ever shown the mold in the basement contaminated sufficiently the bedroom on the third floor that it needed to be remediated. There's not a piece.
It could. I mean, it depends what the levels you're talking about. Again, if you got 100,000 spores per cubic meter flying around and it's active growth all over a basement and your forced air system, I would argue that potentially it is getting up there.
There seems to be some logic to that, right? That's intuitively correct, but it's
well, numerically we've proven it correct. I mean, I can tell you hundreds of times that I've seen extremely high levels in a basement, and with forced air systems and other levels of the house, seeing progressively, they're progressively less as you get up to the upper tier, but the second floor is much higher.
My point is, empirically, who cares? Empirically, none of those levels way beyond that affected the house, right? They didn't affect the aesthetics, the utility, or the health of the occupants. Period. That, right? You
could potentially air scrub.
How do you know they didn't affect the health of the occupant?
I have no literature whatsoever. There's been tens of thousands of research articles done for how long, and none of them repeat each other. None of them have been replicated, even if they start to show a hint of it, and none of them are conclusive. So they lead to a likelihood, but no one ever nails it down. We have a dearth of good information.
Let me overstate the question in response. You mean you want to wait 50 years like we did on tobacco smoke before it's conclusively proven?
That's a red herring argument, because we knew.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is, because we knew tobacco smoke 50 years prior to that did what it did, it was hidden. It was known and hidden, and it was known and argued against. We honestly do not know. This is a very open age, right? There's a lot of information out there. The problem is most of it's being distorted by people who don't have a proper background to interpret the science. So what we have now is a lot of fear, a lot of overreaction, right? The precautionary principle has been overextended beyond belief. So empirically, from our point of view, if we're
there's people that would argue that, but okay.
Right. If we're going to write a standard, we better have some good empirical data. We better have some good research. We have good epidemiological.
We need more. We need more. But I mean, people would argue that there's been a serious intent by, you know, a particular national organization to, you know, to suppress information, you know, and they shall go unnamed.
And I don't buy it.
Okay.
We've been around too long. We've been around too long.
Isn't there a
have been around
incredible article out there? I don't remember who wrote it, World Health or something like that, that talks about the mold industry and the suppression of science in comparison with the cigarette industry and the suppression of information on that, and that does exist. So like what Terry was saying, there is information out there that suggests that there is the link between them, but Scott is saying, you know, but there's no definitive proof, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
All we have is the suggestion of, we don't have the suggestion that it does not. We have the suggestion that it does, and then we have to, again, we're assuming that is correct.
Right. And you know, and I think due diligence, you know, necessitates that you do, you know, you err on the side of safety as opposed to the side of, you know, necessarily finance. But, you know, certainly, I mean, so, you know, here we are, we're way over time. We're gonna have to pull a plug here, but as we did, you know, the previous episode with this discussion, which begs the question, will there be a Subjective Science of Mold Sampling Part 3? And, you know, or a new title because it's getting stale. But yeah, I mean, we don't have those answers, right? Because I would argue, I say this whenever I talk to a prospective client too. I've been doing this for 30 years. I come in and go, and I say I'm Switzerland, which is not necessarily a great example, but, you know, saying I'm in the middle here. I'm seeking out information, trying to make decisions. And what we need to do is separate the anxiety and the hysteria, and also the other side of the coin, right? Understanding being, you know, but erring on the side of, you know, the occupant safety, if we're going to err on the side, but, you know, understand that, you know, we're just going to report what we find. You know, it's like, let's, and I know, yeah, it's hard, especially with a homeowner, to try to detach from, you know, my home's been ruined and my children are sick. That's easy for me to say as the consultant.
Here's the problem. Let me interrupt. Here's the problem.
Okay.
Here's the problem with sampling with regard to what you just said, because everything you just said is correct, right? We want to remain neutral. We want to represent the facts. Here's the problem. They come to the table, and it could be the teachers, it could be the librarian, it could be the police officer,
right.
It could be the homeowner. I don't care
whoever the constituents, the occupants. I mean, they're upset because they're in it, you know.
Yeah, they went to Dr. Google and they found something, or they saw some guy's YouTube channel and watched it, and he told them how damn dangerous these things were, right? So now they come to the table with this preconceived notion of what's going on. And we have to then, like you said, we have to talk them down from the fear that's been generated. That's very, very hard to do, right? So I think that's really part of it. And we have many people who are using samples to generate the fear. So they take the swab sample of a 2x4 in an attic for endotoxins, and they tell the guy that the reason you're sick is you have endotoxins on a 2x4 in your attic, and you have to spend $20,000 to clean your attic. And the guy bought it. The guy thought that was correct because these people sounded so convincing.
Well, right, but I mean, and again, we're past time, but you're right, Scott. I mean, there's a lot of people in the industry that are using data and misrepresenting it to, you know, to drum up sales and use it as a weapon, weaponizing it against the consumer.
Thank you for having me. The answer is, why is their marketing more convincing than our marketing? We've been following.
That's a damn good question.
Right.
Well, I mean, the thing is, information needs to get out there. We, you know, more studies need to be done. You know, there has to be health-based studies, a lot of them, to try to understand this correlation, because there's some correlation there, but we don't, will we ever find the dose response? Maybe not, but at least we should be seeking answers to those questions clearly going forward. So I'm going to cut you both off. Scott Armour, he is an environmental health science consultant. That's a hard. That doesn't just roll off your tongue really comfortably. With Armour Applied Science LLC in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cleveland, damn it! I said Cincinnati on the intro too. Yeah, yes, I didn't write it down. With Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah, it's a big difference. And yeah, okay, not the same place. Thanks to our guests, Pat and Terry. Thanks for jumping in. We appreciate your guys' input. It's fantastic. So show's going to be recorded. Well, show is recorded. I shouldn't say going to be recorded. Show has been recorded and will be available both on healthyindoors.com, but most importantly on the Healthy Indoors online global community. And where is that, you might want to ask? Well, the Healthy Indoors, that's not the slide I wanted. I wanted this slide.
That's not it.
That's not the right slide. Let me try. Oh, no, that's not. Oh, and then it all breaks down suddenly. That's the slide we wanted. So on the Healthy Indoors online global community, that's a place where we're actually are featuring the show. We're making it it's all of our assets plus some other shows and other programs are available even if you're not a member. So it's open to the general public, and that's where we really like to push you. Anything that's got the little orange triangle on the side is totally free and accessible. So even this show, you could see what's going on here, live show. So that's actually real important. We still have our main homepage, healthyindoors.com, which is where our magazine resides. The shows, the podcasts, events, there's a bunch of resources there, tons of documentation and articles. But certainly we're gonna still push the fact that you should if you go to healthyindoors.com, hit that community button and get yourself a free membership to the community. This is really where everything's going to be happening going forward. Now, with regards to that, we also want to talk about this upcoming event in November, the Healthy Buildings America 2021 conference in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's going to be going on November 9th through 11th. This is a really interesting show because the ISIAC conferences, the Healthy Buildings conference series, are typically academic. I mean, they're academia. They're research oriented. That's what ISIAC's primary purpose is. But in this case, with the host organization, CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, the topic here is bridging the gap between research and practice. And this is an opportunity for you, if you're a practitioner, to go out to make a trip to Hawaii, which is pretty cool, and have the opportunity to interface with a bunch of world researchers. So this is a really exciting event. We're a platinum sponsor of the event. We'll be there. We're looking forward. We'll probably actually do a Healthy Indoors live show from there too, which will be interesting. Time zones will get all screwed up, but
Wait, does that mean you're flying me out there to do the show with you?
No, but it means that if you were on that episode, we would hook you up this way through a Zoom meeting, and we would let you be virtually in Hawaii. Yeah. Okay. Again. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thanks to Scott. We're way over time. Those of you who are sitting in there and watching this show, either live or recorded, thank you for being with us again this week. This is an important topic. We've demonstrated again that this is a topic that we haven't had the answers to yet, but at least we're keeping the discussion going, and I think that's critically important. So join us again next week, same bat time, same bat channel, for the Healthy Indoors live show from